Is the end of the war in Ukraine near? Signals, motives, and what lies behind them. But the most important thing I want to tell you today is that the real negotiation process is not happening where the cameras are pointed. We have talked many times. Peace between Ukraine and Russia will come only when the elites of both countries see more benefit in peace than in continuing the fighting. This is not a cynical formula, it's just how politics really works. And now it seems for the first time in 3.5, almost 4 years, yes, this formula is starting to work not just in one but in several directions at once. To this formula of Ukraine plus Russia, we need to add a third player, Europe, which has just, in 1926 approved a loan for Ukraine of 90 million euros for 2 million and hasn't even really had time to use the money yet. To give up such a scale of financial flows, defense procurement, reconstruction contracts, budget spending, there simply isn't a single ruling party, as they say, that would go for that. So, for Europe to also agree to a pause, Europe is tied to Ukraine, and Ukraine is tied, that is, the Ukrainian elite. They're incredibly tied to Europe, right? So they also need very strong motivation because, as I said, no one will voluntarily give up such a prize. And here a new factor comes into play. Not directly, but indirectly, Iran. Where Trump said outright, now I can shift my attention from the Middle East to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That is, in the Middle East, he already knows what will happen. We don't know, maybe he knows that something worked out. Maybe he knows that something didn't work out and won't work out until a certain time, but he came to some decision. This is the status quo. Today we will analyze how all this is connected, what signals suggest the war is nearing its end. Those signals do exist. Why did the Kremlin suddenly start talking publicly instead of quietly through the intelligence services about searching for instigators? They have been instigating, with individual instigators involved. What might really be behind the economic deal between Moscow and Washington? But what is the main point? Why are we even talking about the approaching end of the war right now? Well, in the last few days, maybe weeks, there have been 5 signals. The first one. Donald Trump publicly stated on July 6 that Putin is under pressure. Well, where is the pressure coming from? Not from us, right? So it must be from inside. And he wants to end the war. Well, that's what he keeps saying all the time. It just means that it would be better for Putin to end the war under that pressure than to continue it. So what? And this is an important point. Negotiations are much closer to being finished than people think. Looking ahead, people consider one type of negotiation, while Trump discusses entirely different ones. That's right, and in a way, Zelensky said the same thing. Second, the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Kirilo Budanov, said in an interview with RBC Ukraine that there is a real chance to end the active phase of the conflict as early as 2026. So, as they say, that's how it is. Although before that, according to him, the escalation will only intensify. But this is quite a specific phenomenon. Before reaching an agreement, everyone tries to get the best possible position and to put the opponent in a worse position, yes. Third, July 3rd. Yes, on July 3rd. Putin personally gave a specific public order during a visit to the military. Public, I want you to pay attention once again to find and analyze the instigators behind the continuation of the war. So that means there are some bad people who want the war to continue. But he started this war himself. He has been continuing it for 4 years already and has said 100 times that he is not going to withdraw, and he plans to conquer even more land. So, it's absolutely clear that he is the one inciting the continuation of the war, but he must mean something by that, right? He means something. And publicly. By itself, this sounds more like preparation for winding things down than for continuing hostilities. Right? Yes? I'm looking for instigators who want to, incite me. But I don't want to, and they're inciting me. I'll explain all of this. This strange little knot turns out to be very simple. You just need to pull the right string and it will immediately come undone. Fourth, so economic signals from Russia itself. Record-breaking. First, fuel crisis, budget deficit, collapse of the price of Urals crude. And fifth, according to the Financial Times and The Economist, there are two parallel tracks of negotiations between Moscow and Washington. One is about a ceasefire, and the other is about a huge economic deal, or rather, I would say a package, in the context of possible sanctions relief. I will talk about this second track separately and in detail, because it seems that this is where the driving force behind what is happening is hidden. So if Mikhail Gorbachev were to assess this situation, he would say that's exactly where the root of the problem lies. But before we go any further, an important caveat. Without it, this topic would probably seem naive. For almost 4.5 years of war, predictions about its imminent end have sounded so naive, so many times, that it's worth pausing and recalling at least some of them, just to calibrate our expectations. So in September 2022, Budanov himself, who was in intelligence at the time, as I recall, predicted the return of Crimea by the spring of 2023. Well, it didn't happen. The IMF, in its reviews of Ukraine's economy, kept pushing back its forecast for the end of the war year after year. First, it was the end of 2024. Then the last quarter of 2025, then it was already the middle of 2026. Well, you see what I mean. Yes, Zelensky said in 2023 that the war would end that year. It didn't happen. In October 2024, when presenting the victory plan, he also said, no later than 2025 provided the Allies take decisive action. It's completely unclear what that means. That didn't happen either. The commander of Akhmat, that's Abdi Alaudinov, publicly stated in 2024 that he knew the special military operation would end that same year, referring in his own words to the sacred scripture. That didn't come true either. In the fall of 2025, Zelensky was already speaking much more cautiously, saying that Ukraine would keep fighting if necessary for another 2 or 3 years. I'd add 4, 5, 7, 9. The moral is simple. Ukrainian, Russian, and Western officials systematically miscalculated the timelines in both directions. During the war, those errors were usually on the side of excessive optimism. Therefore, everything that will be said later in this video should not be taken as a prediction, but rather as an analysis of the factors that now seem to be coming together differently than before. Coming together does not necessarily mean they will lead to results within the stated time frame. And here, despite all this justified skepticism, Ukrainians, there is one detail that was simply absent in 2022, 2023, and 2024. Yes, look before the section about the fuel crises, before the section about Dmitriev's deal, because it is precisely the combination of these two factors that now looks fundamentally different from any previous promises made by politicians. Let's get back to Vovan VV. So the question that naturally arises, is it necessary to identify those who are preventing the war from ending? Why announce this publicly, through a press secretary, instead of just giving the intelligence services a confidential instruction? The intelligence services are always tracking someone anyway, even without public statements. There are several versions here, of course, maybe, and none of them have been officially confirmed. This is analysis, not fact. Version number 1, the domestic political one. A high-profile public directive sends a signal to the ruling elite. Well, and for the security apparatus, too. If negotiations to end the war really move forward, all the agencies need to understand in advance that disagreeing with peace will have consequences. In other words, you're under the microscope, my dear colleagues, both ours and others. Yes, it's a kind of vaccine against internal sabotage of the peace process by those security officials and propagandists whose careers and incomes depend on the continuation of the war. There are a couple of such people, right? The second version is that it's a signal to the outside world, primarily to the Baltic countries and some European elites, whom the Kremlin openly calls instigators, a kind of warning before a possible easing of tensions. The third version, the most cynical one, is simply preparing a convenient group of scapegoats in case the terms of peace turn out to be unfavorable for the Kremlin, and they have to explain it to the public. Why didn't the war end with the victory everyone expected, but instead ended, let's say, with a compromise? It's impossible to know for sure which version is correct, but the very fact that it was made public and not kept behind closed doors is a strong sign that some next step is being prepared, one that requires domestic political justification. Let's look at the reality again. By the beginning of July 2026, the fuel crisis in Russia had reached record levels, probably the highest in the entire post-Soviet history of the country, because of massive Ukrainian long-range drone strikes on oil refineries. So the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine made an assessment. About 43% of the oil refining capacity has been taken out of operation. Restrictions on gasoline sales have been introduced, I think, in 40 regions. In Crimea, fuel sales are periodically halted altogether, and prices on the so-called secondary market have reached up to 200 rubles per liter. In just the first half of 2026, 194 attacks on refineries were recorded, which is 11 times more. That's 11 times more than during the same period the previous year. Then there's the budget situation. The Russian budget deficit for 2025 was about 5.7 trillion rubles, almost twice as much as the original plan. Direct foreign investment in the Russian economy has fallen by 56% over the 4 years of war. In general, of course, it's hard to imagine a foreign organization investing in anything in Russia. But if you remember that most foreign organizations are usually offshore companies owned by Russians, and many of them have direct ties to the government, then some things become clear. Nevertheless, even they, after taking money abroad, are not in a hurry to invest it back. Well, the second one, by the way, could be a government investment, like what China does. It might be called something else, but it's still a government investment, and they're not afraid to lose it. And one more thing. Just last week, Bloomberg, the Bloomberg agency, reported that the price of the Russian oil grade, Urals, they call it Urals, has dropped to the level it was before the war with Iran. So it looks like that surge is over, right? We still don't know what's going to happen. There are still bombings and so on, but it looks like the surge is over. It seems that, so to speak, Trump managed to bring down the price of fuel, gasoline, and oil. But there's a catch here that completely changes the picture. Putin wants peace out of weakness. No, the New York Times sources in Western intelligence say the exact opposite. According to the New York Times, citing these intelligence sources from several Western countries, Putin is confident that he is winning the war and is ready to continue it for complete control over the Donetsk region, even if it takes another year and a half or two. According to this version, each additional day of fighting, according to the Kremlin's calculations, only increases and strengthens their negotiating position. This is consistent with information from the Financial Times that Russia does not plan to return to substantive negotiations, at least until February 27, 2027. The Kremlin is counting on first capturing the entire Donetsk region, and only then forcing Kyiv to make concessions. And the fact that for the last round of negotiations, Putin sent his aide Vladimir Medinsky, and not, say, a higher-ranking figure. According to Polish analysts, at the very least, this is a sign that a real compromise is not yet in the Kremlin's plans. We are facing two mutually exclusive scenarios. Well, as is usually the case. The economy is pushing the Kremlin toward peace, while military calculations are pushing for the continuation of the war for territorial gains. Well, the territory in this war is needed solely to tell Russians that we have won, that everything is great, and we have achieved what we wanted. It's impossible to say for sure which of these factors will ultimately prevail. A separate question: could this be related to the midterm elections for the U.S. Congress in November 2026? No one has mentioned a direct connection confirmed by sources so far, but the logic in general suggests itself. It is politically beneficial for Trump to put the issue of the prolonged war to rest before the elections, so he can present voters with his foreign policy achievements. That is why Trump methodically, week after week, repeats the same phrase. We are closer than it seems. We are closer. We are almost there. Putin wants it too. This is a classic technique for preparing public opinion. At the same time, Budanov himself did not name the U.S. elections as the reason for his prediction. So the version about linking it specifically to the American elections, he said that it will end by the end of the year. The active phase of the war will end this year. So this is all an analytical hypothesis, not a direct quote from Ukrainian intelligence. There's a detail that is often overlooked. In mid-June, Trump directly stated that after completing the Iran deal, he would focus on Russia and Ukraine. That is, according to the American president's own words, it was only after the conflict around Iran was resolved. Again, I want to say once more, it seems to us that it hasn't been resolved yet. But God knows, maybe they know something there that we don't know. Washington has, judging by what Trump is doing and saying, freed up diplomatic resources for the Ukraine track. There is no direct evidence in the sources that Russia is giving up the Iranian for the sake of a Ukrainian deal. But it's true. The following is true. American diplomacy works consistently on one major conflict at a time, and Ukraine apparently is next in line precisely because the acute phase of the Iranian crisis has already passed. And Russia realized that there is nothing more to gain from this. Well, besides that, the Americans explained something to them, and now actually comes the most substantial part of this video, because what is publicly presented as peace negotiations may, in practice, be just the tip of the iceberg called the greatest deal. And the numbers there, gentlemen, are such that it becomes clear the real negotiation process is not happening where the cameras are showing. According to The Economist and Reuters, alongside the public track of ceasefire negotiations in Istanbul, Budapest, Geneva, and Germany, there is also a non-public track. It is being conducted by Putin's special representative for investments, Kirill Dmitriev, directly with representatives of Trump, primarily with Steve Witkoff and, according to some sources, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Even before the meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska, Moscow prepared a document with a package of proposals, which sources and economists called the greatest deal between Russia and the U.S. And so when people in Russia talk about the spirit of Alaska or the meaning of Alaska, they mean that Putin and Trump have reached some kind of fundamental agreement there, even if it's still without details. And so the spirit that we would follow this path lingered after Alaska, and then supposedly something happened there or didn't happen. So what is included in the package between Russia and the USA? Joint development of oil and gas in the Arctic. This is a region where Russia has enormous untapped reserves, but lacks both capital and technology, especially after Western companies left in 2022. Next, joint extraction of rare earth metals. This is critically important for American technology and the defense industry. And China practically has a monopoly in this area. Construction of a data center in Russia powered by nuclear energy. That is, in fact, the integration of American technology companies into Russia's energy and digital infrastructure. And as a separate, rather exotic point, the project of a tunnel under the Bering Strait, which would connect Chukotka with Alaska. This was discussed back in Tsarist Russia in the 20th century, but it never went beyond talk. I know for sure that this is just Shoigu's favorite brainchild, because I personally discussed it with his assistants. According to sources, the entire package is estimated at about $12 trillion. Just think about it. Not billions. Trillions of dollars. We never really dealt with numbers like that, except maybe in the last few years. That's a huge amount. Comparable. That's about a quarter of the annual U.S. GDP. This very package is already being presented by Russian propaganda inside the country as a diplomatic success of the Russian Federation. In other words, the Kremlin is preparing its own population for the fact that normalization of relations with the U.S. and not victory on the battlefield will become the main political prize in this war. Here's the package. This is what I want you to understand most. Putin has found the kind of victory with which he can go before the public and say, here is what we have achieved, something fantastic, and that's why we are ending the war. Ukraine becomes so unimportant, or rather, Ukraine becomes a small part of that huge deal that the two, in Putin's words, great powers, America and Russia, have started making together. The logic here is fairly straightforward. If you lay it out completely, Russia has natural resources and territory. There is no capital, no technology, in part because of sanctions. The U.S. has an abundance of capital and technology, but there is a strong interest in diversifying rare earth metal supplies outside of China, as well as in new sources of energy. I actually have only one question. How outraged will China get if this deal goes through? But let me remind you that Nixon once flew to China and made an agreement with them that they would not form an alliance with the Soviet Union. It was a very skillful move, and my former partner with whom I had a business in the 90s flew to China, well, together with Nixon, after Nixon, yes, and he told me how all of this was done. Another thing is that America made several foolish mistakes. And these mistakes were made by unbelievable people who had nothing to do with real business, but lived in a world of academic discussions about what is good and what is bad. Well, just like Karl Marx, who wrote the most popular book on economics in the world without ever visiting a single enterprise in his life. Now a similar move is underway. There is an attempt to separate Moscow from Beijing, and let's hope that the business people conducting negotiations won't repeat the same mistakes that Nixon and his people made, and won't make any other foolish mistakes. The deal formula is: Russia opens access to resources, the U.S. lifts sanctions and provides capital and technology, and in return the Kremlin agrees to end or freeze the war, because without lifting the sanctions, this whole package simply cannot be technically implemented. Of course, Russia will not leave Ukraine, but it may freeze the conflict, so to speak, along the line where they currently stand. If this is really the case, and well, there are few confirmed details, most of it is gathered from leaks and analysts' and not from official statements from the parties, then Putin suddenly gets a much stronger economic incentive to end the war. A much stronger one than any humanitarian considerations, not because the war is immoral, right? But because peace opens access to money and technology that are now critically lacking due to the fuel crisis and the drop in oil prices. And here we should return to where we started, to the elites on both sides. It means that peace must be more beneficial for them than war, so that they choose peace. Judging by the content of the deal being discussed, the Russian elites are being offered not humiliation and defeat, but a completely new source of enrichment. Legal, huge, for years to come. This coincides exactly with the moment when the old source of income, oil exports, at wartime prices, started to collapse due to sanctions and strikes on refineries. But there's also the flip side of this logic, which applies to Europe. Just a month ago, in April 2026, the European Union approved a loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine for 2 years. That is 60 billion for defense and 30 for budget support. First, several billion euros have already been allocated earlier in June for production. Ukrainian drone production has begun, and more packages are on the way. At the same time, another 100 billion euros from the next long-term EU budget is being discussed, and this is for the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war, if the war ends. These are gigantic multi-year flows of money. Defense orders for European arms manufacturers, contracts for infrastructure reconstruction, jobs, political capital for those parties that push these packages through parliaments. A system like this, once it gains momentum, has its own inertia. There are too many participants, from military-industrial complexes and companies to construction corporations, that get contracts for reconstruction, and there, hell, you have to rebuild half the country. They are all interested in making sure these flows don't stop abruptly, I don't have direct evidence of deliberate prolongation of the war in the interests of specific companies or parties. That should be emphasized. Well, so as not to slip into cheap conspiracy theories, but structurally it's quite a workable hypothesis. The larger and more complex the system of financing the war and future reconstruction becomes, the harder it is to shut it down with a single political decision, even if the U.S. leadership sincerely wants peace, which I can't be 100% sure of. Here, too, a very strong countervailing incentive is needed. For example, a real prospect of getting a share of contracts for the reconstruction of Ukraine right now through active participation in negotiations, rather than after the fact. So, confirmed facts. Public statements by Trump about how close negotiations are, public orders by Putin to find the instigators, a catastrophic fuel crisis in Russia, America, and Russia, with 45% and 43% of oil refining capacities out of commission, and a record deficit in the Russian budget. The existence of a private economic track in the negotiations through Dmitriev, which was reported by Reuters economists, alone means Europe is extending Ukraine a €90 billion loan for 2024-2027, and there are plans for another $100 billion for reconstruction. The systematic inaccuracy of past predictions about the end of the war from both sides is a fact. I want to explain once again the trick that the Europeans are using. They don't have money, but they have plenty of property that naturally belongs to the citizens of their country. So what do? They go to private banks and say, give us $90 or even $100 billion on terms that would be profitable for you. Well, it's clear that banks give on terms that are profitable for them, but here I want to emphasize that the terms can be just profitable, or they can be super profitable, not just profitable, right? You give us huge amounts of money and we guarantee you the repayment of this money with high interest, because if we don't pay back, you take from us. You seize our ships, buildings, currency, income, taxes. There. We have it, so don't worry, you'll get your money. And the terms are as follows. Delay the start of loan repayments for as long as possible. Or structure the loan so that at first the payments are smaller and later they get bigger. Why? Why is this necessary? The thing is, the politicians who are currently in power want the loan repayments to start after they retire. So, well, it paints quite a picture. Some people take the money and get kickbacks in one form or another. Of course, it's clear that it's not just money and so on. Then they quietly move on to other jobs or retire, start writing books, or run universities. And then the people who had nothing to do with borrowing that money, meaning us, the taxpayers, in this case, European taxpayers, yes, so not us. Yes, they start paying for what they stole. At the same time, this is supposed to make Ukrainians happy. This specific money will have to be paid back not to them, even though they will receive it, partially receive it, yes, but to the Europeans, while at the same time using this money to bring Ukraine into the European Union. This guarantees that Ukraine's industry will not be restored in such a way that it becomes competitive with the industries of the main countries of the European Union. So this accomplishes another very important goal. Ukraine does not become a developed country. Ukraine's reconstruction ends up in the hands of the European Union. It will become a third world country from which resources are extracted and people are sent to work in other countries. Well, countries that are developed countries. That is, Ukraine becomes a banana republic and serves as a place to recruit soldiers for the European Union army. This is also one of the important tasks set by the European Union, because the population of Europe is simply no longer capable. Ukraine fights on the battlefield and Ukrainians are capable. So, in order for them not to want to stay at home but to want to join the army, it is necessary to create conditions in which being in the army would be better for them than being at home. EU representatives and Ukraine's presidential administration are working on this. Versions and analytical hypotheses. The link between timing and the November U.S. elections. The idea the Kremlin is giving out for the sake of a deal on Ukraine. The specific content of what exactly Trump personally promised to regarding Ukraine. The specific content of the deal, what exactly Trump personally promised Putin besides lifting sanctions. The thesis that European institutional interests are deliberately slowing down the peace process. And so, none of this is directly confirmed by sources. These are all my personal conspiracy theories. Despite all the uncertainty, one conclusion can be stated with confidence, nevertheless. For the first time in a long while, the interests of the economy, politics, and public pressure within all three key players, Russia, the US, and Europe, are starting to pull towards some kind of result, rather than just continuing the status quo. This is not a guarantee of peace. We just recalled how many times similar predictions have already failed to come true, but this is a fundamentally different point than it was a year ago. For the first time, not only humanitarian declarations are on the table, but also specific huge amounts of money that are physically impossible to receive without ending the war in some form, in some way, a freeze or a thaw or something else. And the more closely we follow the real numbers, fuel, the budget, the price of oil, the content of economic deals, and not just the loud statements from the podium, the more accurately we understand where history is really heading. Clarity is, well, I think, always better than illusions, no matter which direction it is aimed. And here I can't help but be a bit sarcastic because that's just my nature. I was always very pleased when commentators, analysts, and not-so-successful politicians called Witkoff and Kushner idiots. I always thought, how much of an idiot do you have to be to consider Kushner and Witkoff idiots? If you found this video interesting and useful, subscribe to the Telegram channel Leon Weinstein US, where I follow the development of this topic and others between major episodes. And we'll see each other, ladies and gentlemen, very soon, because so much news is coming in that as soon as I finish this episode, I immediately start working on the next one. Goodbye.